mind of the wealthy and educated classes at the turn of the 18th century was devoted to the past. Not its own past, but the ancient grandeur of Greece and Rome. It was more than just a question of taste, adopting the aesthetics of the classical world. It came from a whole perception of history. For the classical inheritance was seen as the unquestioned basis of European culture. The known past and all civilization had begun with the Greeks and Romans. But beyond this world of refinement and reason, out in the English countryside, there lay the mysterious legacy of a more ancient and unknown past. When most people still believed in magic and witchcraft, strange wonders like Stonehenge were regarded with awe and superstition. And it's not surprising they were thought of as the work of giants or magicians, since otherwise how did they fit within the established vision of the past? Nothing was known of their origins. No ancient historians had written about them. They were indeed prehistoric. But by the beginning of the 18th century, some people had begun to face the challenge of what such monuments could mean. Not by relying on classical authors or medieval chroniclers, or simply speculating from their armchairs, but by going out and looking at the monuments themselves, looking at the physical remains of the past. It was then that archaeology began.
I was born on November the 7th, 1687. My ancestors, both paternal and maternal, lived from time immemorial in or upon the edges of this marshy level. And I ever had a most entire love for the county of Lincolnshire.
The fens in William Stukeley's time were extremely remote. Change had come slowly here over the centuries, and he grew up fascinated by a sense of the past all around him. He walked the straight line of Roman roads. He collected Roman coins turned up by the plough. And by the age of 16, he was drawing ancient monuments, abbeys and parish churches, like the church at Holbeach where he was born. His solitary wanderings and studies as a boy came from a natural, inborn curiosity. But reaching even into the country towns of his day was a whole new intellectual climate. It was the age of Newton, Wren, the Royal Society, and a spirit of scientific inquiry into all the works of man and nature. It was this which would inspire in Stukeley the desire to look and analyse afresh the remains of the English past. Only a few miles from Holbeach was Crowland Abbey. Stukeley often returned here, always drawn to places which evoked an ancient spirituality.
I never failed to take a contemplative walk to the Abbey. It was a vast delight to me to traverse the sacred precincts and view its most venerable ruins, a noble monument to the piety of our ancestors. Though so sadly mangled by the insulting claws of time, the Abbey rears its ragged head over all the level to be seen at a great distance, as wonderful for its situation as its magnitude and beauty.
What is fascinating about Stukeley is that he responded to the remains of the past in two almost contradictory ways. The first was with a scholarly detachment and precise observation, the desire to record as accurately as possible everything he saw. You see this in his drawings, and it's a direct reflection of the new scientific spirit of the time. But besides that, he also had a wonderfully emotional enthusiasm for ancient places. He says himself that he would often come and sit somewhere like this for hours, simply letting his imagination roam and sensing the layers of history in his surroundings. A passion for the past in Stukeley's day was not something from which you could earn a living. It had to be a gentlemanly hobby. His family were fairly well off. He was able to go to Cambridge, study medicine, and then enter practice as a country doctor. Being a doctor would allow him the time to indulge his real interests.
The world is filled with accounts of the genteel and fashionable tours of France and Italy, whilst our own country lies like a neglected province. A more intimate knowledge of Britain is more useful and as worthy a part of education as the view of any transmarine parts. 'Tis not impossible to make a classic journey on this side of the Straits of Dover.
From 1710, when Stukeley was 23, he began to go on a series of tours around England, on horseback with a small group of gentlemen friends. It was partly for the exercise that he prescribed himself for his gout, but it was above all in search of the history hidden within the English landscape. It was a very new attitude. In those days, such journeys of discovery were almost unheard of. The countryside was not thought interesting or beautiful, but with its awful roads was simply an impediment that stopped you getting from one centre of comfort to another. But things had begun to improve slightly as Stukeley went on his tours. John Ogilby had just produced a new series of road maps, and these led Stukeley on into Oxfordshire, towards a turning point in his studies, his first encounter with the remote past.
What is the greatest antiquity we have yet seen? 'Tis the rollright stones, a large circle of stones pitched on end of very unequal bigness. 'Tis a noble rustic sight, and strikes an odd humour upon the spectator.
And the powers of the mind be here now.
Even today, the Rollright Stones is a magical place, and a magnet for people like the White Witches who believe in its supernatural powers.
Earth, be here now. Be here now. The power of the earth.
Stukeley was told many curious stories about the stones, some of which are still believed, but no one could ever count them. Touching the stones would encourage childbearing, that they were an ancient king and his knights frozen into stone, who sometimes would take on their human form and make merry with local villagers.
We are the new people, we are the old people, we are the same people, stronger than before. We are the old people, we are the new people, we are the same people, stronger than before. We are the old people, we are the new people, we are the same people, stronger than before.
Stukeley had never seen anything like the Rollright stones before. In Lincolnshire, there are no stone circles. And in fact, there are none at all in England to the east of here. So this must have been very new and very strange. Unlike the abbeys, the parish churches, and the Roman roads he was familiar with, here there were no easy explanations. But the stones clearly, he reckoned, are not a ride by magic. At some point in ancient times, some group of people had dragged these enormous limestone boulders here and then set them up in an almost perfect circle.
Even when first confronted by such extraordinary remains as this, Stukeley's reaction was scientific and systematic, to draw them and then offer a considered explanation.
There are many different opinions concerning these very venerable pieces of antiquity. Many fabulous stories retailed of them. I can't but suppose them to have been an heathen temple of our ancestors, perhaps in the Druids' time.
In search of evidence to explain the ancient marvel he'd just seen, Stukeley rode on with his companions to the final goal of his tour, Oxford, one of the greatest centres of 18th century learning. But even in the university colleges, with their famous libraries, he discovered few clues. All he read proved no more than legend and superstition. It's in the Bodleian Library that most of Stukeley's own papers are now collected. Writings on many subjects: natural history, medicine and religion, as well as antiquities. But this range of interest was typical of the time.
It is part of the attempt to accomplish a survey of all available knowledge. This was the great thing which marked the Renaissance, and particularly Francis Bacon, the idea that it would be possible to master the phenomenal universe is what it really amounted to.
Stukeley's first great published work on antiquities, the Itinerarium Curiosum, itself reflected this approach. It described and illustrated the enormous variety of ancient sites he visited on his tours. The book was addressed to gentlemen who had a curiosity about the remains of the past, and was designed to encourage others to make the same kind of researches. It gave Stukeley a special place among the antiquaries of the time.
They were people who nowadays, many of them, we would class as historians, dealing with documentary sources. Those who dealt with sources which were not documentary, in other words, the monuments of antiquity in the field, and monuments of antiquity, whether they were medieval churches or whether they were prehistoric stone circles, they formed a little minority among the antiquaries. And it was from that minority, of which Stukeley was one, and one of the most influential, that what we call archaeology today eventually developed, not from those who were using the literary texts as their sole authority.
Of all the monuments in the field that Stukeley saw, it was Avebury in Wiltshire which was to captivate him and convince him that his life's work lay in the study of stone circles. In the 18th century, carriages from London passed through here on their way along the main road to Bath. But few people even noticed the stones, though the diarist and antiquary John Aubrey had described the village's remarkable remains in the 1690s. It was Aubrey's account which brought Stukeley to Avebury in 1719. It seemed like a gigantic version of the Rollright stones.
I cannot conceive of anything bolder than the idea of those people that entertained a design of setting up these stones. The ditch alone is a very great labor and makes the appearance of a huge amphitheater. The earth is thrown on the outside, quite contrary to the nature of fortifications.
He soon completed a rough sketch, like Aubrey had done before, showing the outer ditch and stone circle, and two smaller circles within. But for Stukeley, a sketch was only the beginning.
When I abode here for several summers together, I was very careful in tracing it out. I laid it all down in the nature of a survey on large imperial sheets of paper.
Survey work then was not such a crude procedure as one might think. The plane table and compass were already commonly used for transferring angles and distances onto paper. For measuring, there was the rather cumbersome chain, invented by Mr. Gunter in the 1630s, which had links of a fixed length.
Okay, right. That's about 45 feet. 45 feet.
To help him with his measurements, Stukeley used local people and gentleman companions. This was the beginning of field archaeology, a trying business moving delicate equipment amongst the fences and farmland.
Well, this is the sort of instrument that Stukeley would have used, and what he called a theodolite, which was a perfectly good name for it, but not what we think of now as the optical theodolite. It has a compass in the middle for getting your bearings, sights, like the plate table Alidade, and you read off on here what the actual bearing is. So if you go over to the middle of the stone, Stukeley was brought up in a country lawyer's office, and his family were small landowners. Hold that for a moment. Well, if you had any form of land, you wanted to know how much you got. And so any gentleman with any property at all, you measured it up yourself. It was part of your general training. Yes, that's fine. Good, thank you.
Stukeley had begun his survey work none too soon. Conservation was not an 18th century concern. As fast as he recorded the stones, they were being destroyed. This was led by local farmer Tom Robinson, the stone killer Stukeley called him, who broke up the stones for building houses. Huge pits were dug under them, where fires were lit. Water was then poured on the roasting stones, so they would crack more easily. This vandalism Stukeley compared to the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition, but he could do nothing to stop it.
This stupendous fabric, which for some thousands of years had braved the continual assaults of weather, and if left to itself, like the pyramids of Egypt, would have lasted as long as the globe, must have fallen sacrifice to the wretched ignorance and avarice of a little village unluckily placed within it.
His eventual achievement, unique for its time, was a detailed bird's-eye view of the position of the remains within the village. A ground plot, as he called it. It described everything as he saw it in the 1720s, and has proved a priceless record for modern archaeologists. Though Stukeley's ground plot made the earthwork much too perfect a circle, more recent excavation and survey has confirmed its general accuracy. But where, he wondered, had the great stones come from? The answer was close to hand. They were sandstone boulders or sarsens scattered a mile or so away. Stukeley believed that sarsens had got there by rising to the surface of the earth like currents in a spinning bun. He realized that their transport to the site must have required extraordinary organization and manpower. The challenge of Avebury to ancient man was fully revealed in the 1930s with the excavation and restoration work of Alexander Keeler. He discovered many great sarsens that had been buried in the Middle Ages under the orders of the Church as works of the devil. 15 of these were re-erected. But one man today believes he can tell where all of them once stood, using a technique as curious as anything encountered by Stukeley.
Now, I believe that each and every one of the stones of this circle is still here, has not disappeared. It's still here in aura or emanation. I'm just going to use this Y rod, which is plastic, so there's nothing magnetic. I'm going to put tension on it like that. See what happens when I go towards the stone. Now there's an aura or energy field around that stone. And if I use these other rods, just by way of demonstration, and I'm just going to hold these more or less parallel and fairly horizontal, see what happens when I go towards the stone. There's an aura or energy field around the stone. Would you like to try that, sir? Yes. Now let me say that I've done this with hundreds of people, and as long as they hold the rods correctly, they all experience the same reaction. Now just hold them parallel, don't let anything touch, and more or less horizontal like a 6-gun, and take it slowly. Just walk it slowly. Keep going. Now you didn't try and do that, did you? No. All right. Have you done this before? Never. Never. Thank you very much. Now if you think that's strange, let me show you something else. Now there's a concrete marker behind me which tells us where a stone used to be. Now that stone is still there in aura or energy field, and we can find the shape of it. Again, this time I'll close my eyes, and if you want to, you can go over the other side just to see that I'm not sort of cheating at all, if you like, and I'll just walk in and see if I can pick up the energy field there it is, around the stone. I'm just going to put that down there and come back again. Again, I'll close my eyes and we'll see what happens. I'll face you so that I don't know what's happening, but there, again, is the energy field around the stone, and we can find the shape of that stone by going round it, seeing where it actually extended to, just as it does on the other one. There it is. And there it is. And you'll find that Alexander Keeler did not put that concrete marker back in the right place. It's just slightly off-centre.
If the Rollright Stones was a heathen temple, then Avebury, Stukeley believed, must have been a great centre of ancient religion, a primitive cathedral. What seemed to lend it even more sacred power was a long avenue of standing stones that headed from the circle towards the south, a via sacra, Stukeley called it. Some stones in what is now known as the West Kennet Avenue were re-erected by Keeler, but many have been destroyed or are still buried, and it does not now extend very far. But a panorama Stukeley sketched shows just how much of it existed in his day. And it ended in another smaller circle, which excavation has proved did once exist. But Stukeley also found the signs of a second avenue, the so-called Beckhampton Avenue, though even in the 18th century there were few traces left. Its route is still today a matter of considerable debate. Brian Ashley thinks he knows where it went. He believes he can follow the aura or emanation of the stones, even if there is little sign of them in the ground.
The edge of the avenue and see what happens. There we go. Now,
Yeah,
you did experience that, didn't you?
Well, there's something there, yeah.
There's something there, right.
But
well,
that's directly in line, isn't it, between the stone and...
It goes
so it's
along
heading
here.
up towards the hill.
What I'd like to do now with you is just to follow this particular flow
Yeah.
and just see where it finishes, shall we?
Okay.
And see how it compares with Stukeley.
Right, good.
I had to admit that the dowsing rods did indicate two parallel lines of something leading towards a clump of trees. We were certainly following an old and well-worn trackway, but how old was it?
My own feeling is that this western approach, it's now called an Iron Age earthworks on the top here. Nobody's done any digging up here, so we don't know what it is. But I've got a feeling that this was a Neolithic footpath coming into the Avebury region. And just as the other avenue narrowed... It's almost certainly the first piece of structure that one would see coming into Avebury from the west. The West Kennet Avenue was approximately 1.5 miles long and finished in a small circle. The Beckhampton Avenue, which Stukeley first drew in 1719, he made it about 1.5 miles, and so do I, but my finish is about 200, 300 yards away from his. The circle, which is the exact dimensions, it's about 20 metres across, is the same as the sanctuary at the end of the West Kennet Avenue. And William Stukeley was quite right in the first part of his sort of designation of the avenue, and he was only about 300 yards out, because down below there is Fox's Covert, where he said it finished, although the stones had disappeared. But I believe that this is where it finished, and I'll show you the circle now. Find the edge of the circle. There it is. And if I come out here, as I move in, there's the flow of the circle, just the same as we had at Avebury. I can quite understand people having reservations about it. All I can say is that I've had an academic background. I'm a fairly straight, sceptical sort of person, and I believe in it. And I would very much like to see some kind of comparison with what I think I've discovered. And it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to sort of just compare what you might call a stupid method with the scientific method. I'm quite convinced that I've got something anyway. And there it is.
To understand more about the builders of the circles, Stukeley now examined other ancient monuments around Avebury. This is the West Kennet Long Barrow. About 5,000 years ago, in Neolithic times, 50 or so individuals were buried here, their bones piled in stone-lined compartments, after it seems their bodies had first been left in the open to decompose. Stukeley could not have known the great age of the barrow, nor entered here. It was only excavated in the 1950s. But he concluded that if the stone circles were temples, then this may have been where a high priest was buried. And assuming that all the monuments in the area were erected at the same time, if this was the burial place of a high priest, then a quarter of a mile to the north might be the greatest tomb of all, perhaps that of the ruler, the Lord of Avebury. Silbury Hill. He called it the largest barrow in the country, and perhaps in all England. In fact, it's the greatest man-made mound in the whole of Europe. As usual, Stukeley was given explanations of it by local people. Some said it was the burial mound of a certain King Zell, who could be seen galloping over the downs on moonlit nights. Others that it was a sack of chalk dropped by the devil who had been on his way to bury the people of Marlborough. There have been many stories and theories about it over the years, but still no one knows what it was for. Archaeologists have tunneled into it but found nothing. Whatever its purpose, its construction was a breathtaking achievement of prehistoric man. Stukeley would often make the climb to the top to survey and sketch the surrounding downs, though his paper did tend to blow about a bit in the wind. It was also a favourite picnic spot where he would invite along interested gentlemen and their ladies who had heard of the famous Dr. Stukeley's researches.
From the top here, Stukeley would have been able to demonstrate to any group of admirers he might have had with him a very accurate observation that he'd made concerning the date of Silbury Hill. In his day, there was a Roman road, which he could see quite clearly. It's now pretty well covered by the modern one, which headed from the west directly towards the mound. But then, just before reaching it, it deviated sharply to avoid it. It was a clear sign that the hill was older than the road.
By 1723, after 4 summers of fieldwork here, Stukeley found himself grappling with the idea of an ancient British past, until then inconceivable.
I am not dubious in thinking that the time when the Temple of Avebury was built is of the extremest antiquity, as much older than the Roman times as since the Romans to our time. Yet this temple, when in perfection, must have been the work of a very great and learned people.
For Stukeley, Avebury was merely the beginning of a study of stone circles throughout the country. He also started to reflect more upon the builders of such monuments. All that was known then of pre-Roman Britain came from Roman authors such as Caesar and Tacitus. And in describing the ancient Britons, they wrote of the Druids as their high priests. John Aubrey had first made the connection, and it seemed logical. The Druids, priests of the Britons, who led worship in stone circles. Stukeley could visualize the Britons driven back by the Romans, preserving their druidical culture in remote parts. In the wilds of the Lake District, a romantic landscape that would prove more and more attractive to 18th century taste. Mountains, druids, and stone circles seemed to go naturally together. Castlerig in Cumbria is typical of the more simple circles he saw on his travels. He also observed here characteristics that were common to many others. It was in a prominent position in the landscape, close to the source of a river, maybe a special sacred ingredient. And it seemed to have a deliberate alignment. The entrance faced directly towards the north. These features made Castlereagh a perfect setting for primitive worship. Perhaps it was the worship of the sun and the moon, led by the Druids. Stukeley's visit here would be incorporated into his developing system of classification. He drew up plans of other circles he saw and compared their different features. All he observed were away from greatest Roman influence in the north and the west of Britain.
A serious view of this magnificent wonder is apt to put a thinking and judicious person into a kind of ecstasy when he views the struggle between art and nature, the grandeur of that art that hides itself and seems unartful. For though the contrivance that put this massive frame together must have been exquisite, yet the founders endeavored to hide it by the seeming rudeness of the work. It pleases like a magic spell, and the greatness of every part surprises.
Stonehenge, Stukeley was convinced from the start, was comparable to Avebury. It must have been built by the same people. The same type of stone had been used, sarcens from the Marlborough Downs. But it was clearly an advance, a refinement. Unlike at Avebury or Rollright, here the stones had been roughly hewn into shape. And nowhere else had the concept of stone lintels been developed. Since Stonehenge was so much better known than Avebury, he faced a number of theories as to who had built it. In medieval times, it was thought that Merlin had been the architect. It was also attributed to Saxons, Danes, and more recently to the Romans by the famous architect Inigo Jones.
With his experience of Avebury and other stone circles, Stukeley was sure that Stonehenge could not possibly be Roman. The fact that no Roman author had ever once mentioned it also seemed pretty conclusive evidence. But he came up with some ingenious forms of proof of his own. First, he reckoned that if it was Roman, then its dimensions should be in Roman units of measurement. Whoever makes any ancient building, he said, commonly forms it upon the measure in use among the people of that place. So by reading the classical authors and studying Roman remains in St. Albans and London, he worked out for himself the length of the Roman foot, about 11.5 English inches, which is about right for the standard Roman foot. He then set about testing whether multiples of Roman feet fitted the dimensions of Stonehenge.
In 2.5 days, he and an aristocratic patron, Lord Winchelsea, took some 2,000 measurements. The Roman foot, he concluded, did not fit, and he came up with another measurement of 20 4/5 English inches that did. This, he persuaded himself, was the standard unit used at all stone circles, the Druid cubit. Stukeley was developing a very patriotic view of ancient British achievements. He saw in Stonehenge the origins of all architecture. As at Avebury, he soon discovered that the temple was only one component in the ancient landscape. He was the very first to notice an avenue bounded by earth embankments, not stones, that led from the circle northeast. Another observation he made was that at midsummer it faces towards the sunrise. Further north was a feature that is barely visible today, even from the air, though confirmed on the ground by archaeologists. A mysterious enclosure of parallel earthworks which runs east-west for almost half a mile. Stukeley called it the Cursus and imagined it to be an ancient British hippodrome.
A delightful prospect from the temple, when this vast plain was crowded with chariots. The exquisite softness of the turf prevents any great damage by a fall. It is the finest piece of ground imaginable for a horse race.
The most visible and numerous earthworks here were the barrows, and Stukeley's interest in them was very different from that of his contemporaries. In those days, barrow digging was a treasure-hunting sport enjoyed by the gentry, a vastly destructive activity which lasted well into the 19th century. Enormous holes would be dug through the middle of them in the search for ancient curiosities to adorn the drawing room.
Stukeley dug into more than a dozen barrows around Stonehenge. The finance and the labour for his operations were provided by the Earl of Pembroke, who would often ride up here from Wilton House, which is only a few miles away, to join in. From his descriptions, you can actually pinpoint the very barrows that they dug, and this is one that he described in some detail. It's interesting because it is, in fact, a double barrow. Within the ditch, you have two humps, this larger one here, and another one slightly flattened out a little further along. Now, they dug down into this larger hump and found here the bones of a man. Stukeley then decided he'd carry on and dig the more flattened section to see whether that contained perhaps the wife of the man buried here. Now, what is remarkable is the way they went about it. They didn't just dig an enormous treasure hunter's pit right in the middle of it. They actually dug a trench, or a section, right across it from east to west. And as they proceeded, Stukeley took notes of the composition, the makeup of the barrow, and of everything they found.
He produced the first section drawing of a barrow ever made, showing the different layers of turf, chalk, and flints that they came upon. At the heart of the mound, they found a rudely wrought clay urn. It crumbled as soon as they picked it up, but inside were ornaments and a number of burnt bones.
From the size of the bones and the nature of the ornaments, Stukeley believed that the burial must have been that of a young girl of about 14 years of age. If it wasn't the wife of the man next door, perhaps it was his daughter. A final delightful touch was that he didn't take the bones away for analysis, as a modern archaeologist might do. Instead, he recomposed the ashes of the illustrious defunct, as he put it. He covered them up again with earth, and then put two large poles on the top of the mound as visible markers to dissuade anyone from ever disturbing her again. As far as we know, her bones are probably still here.
Stukeley's work led him to challenge other notions as to what the barrows were for.
Many, from the great quantity of these tumuli, injudiciously conclude that there have been great battles upon the plain, and that the slain were buried there. But they are really no other than family burying places, set near the temple, for the same reason that we bury in churchyards.
The most formidable group of barrows at Stonehenge are the king barrows, covered by trees since Stukeley's day.
He was quite astute in observing where they were located, their topographic location on the tops of ridges where they could be clearly seen from other barrow groups or from important sites. And his limited explorations into the structure of them did suggest the way in which they were built, often with a turf central core capped over by white chalk excavated from the surrounding ditches, that they would have been extremely visible within the landscape, not covered in nice mown green grass as they are these days, but actually gleaming white monuments in a green landscape. He realised that important people were buried within mounds of this sort. He was hampered to a certain extent by the ideas of his particular century, in that he thought that, as he lived in a hierarchical society, that there must have been one at that time, and that therefore the bigger the barrow, the more important the person. Whereas we know now that there is an element of chronology in this, that some are older than others.
How much have you benefited today from his fieldwork?
We've benefited greatly, I think, from his observations of a landscape which has changed quite radically since the 1720s, when he was observing the Stonehenge area. He could see things almost as untouched downland, which had probably stayed very much the same, perhaps in this area, since the Roman period. The effects of ploughing, which have now unfortunately removed a lot of the more subtle traces of the archaeological landscape, hadn't really taken effect at that time. He obviously hadn't got access to all the techniques that we have today for dating and scientific analysis, but as an observer of broad landscapes and an interpreter, even given the problems that he had with his interpretation, I think he's of enormous value to us in the 20th century.
So much the modern archaeologist, Stukeley would have relished using today's scientific techniques, above all for dating. Here, within sight of Silbury, Archaeologists from the University of Wales are excavating on Windmill Hill. There are no standing stones, just a ring of earthworks. Stukeley came here, but he could not have known how important this site is. For it is only modern dating techniques which have revealed that it was occupied by the ancestors of the circle builders, about 4000 BC. Excavation also enables archaeologists now to approach the question of what Windmill Hill was used for.
A lot of the evidence here suggests that there's rather special kinds of deposition going on. A lot of the bone waste is rather carefully placed at certain points through the sequence of layers in the ditches. Now this concentration on food, and a lot of the bones suggest a great emphasis on meat consumption. It's big chunky meat waste, shoulder blades, ribs, nice juicy bits, taken with the rather special nature of the site. This very curious layout, large, triple ringed, yet with multiple points of access. This suggests that this is in fact a rather special social arena. It is not something probably that belongs to the everyday world, although that everyday world is not far away from it, round about in settlements which we find in the fields.
The earthworks on Windmill Hill are the earliest evidence of major communal construction in the area. The discovery of an intact human skeleton provided other clues as to what might have taken place here.
I'm fairly sure it's something in the region of 30 to 35 years or so in age, basing this at the moment on the wear on the teeth. This is an interesting burial because it seems as if it's decomposed to some extent at the bottom of the pit without being covered with a lot of matrix. Not much earth has been put on it. And in actual fact, we're also intrigued by the fact that there seem to be a lot of amphibians, frogs or toads, at the bottom of the pit on the body, and possibly also small mammals, voles or mice or something of this sort. It suggests that it was left exposed. The sort of thing which we know in the 18th century in America, the Amerindians were exposing their dead for periods of time as a part of a burial ritual. And we may well have evidence of this sort of thing, special exposure of the bodies in the pits before finally they were covered up.
The site itself, the actual physical location, stands out. It dominates its territory. It goes on in use for a long time. It's there. It's part of the physical and social landscape still at the point when other sites begin to take over from it, such as Avebury and Silbury Hill.
Stukeley's problems of chronology can now be solved. About 2700 BC, the people of Windmill Hill switched their focus to the Avebury area. They built the great mound of Silbury, and then the circles and avenues, 500 years before Stonehenge. But if we know their dates, do we know even today what these sites were for?
The scale of monuments like the Avebury Circles and like Stonehenge, and the extraordinary expenditure of communal effort that went into their construction, would suggest to anyone that they must have had a religious purpose, that the most sacred beliefs of ancient people were expressed in some way among these stones. But there is very little evidence for the nature of their beliefs. The presence of human burials beneath some of the stones, human remains found in the ditches, might indicate, for example, elaborate rites to do with death. Other evidence, including the clear astronomical alignment of many circles, also suggests ceremonial to do with the changing seasons, with fertility and the agricultural cycle. But most of this can only be speculation. Ultimately, archaeologists have to be very cautious. The truth is, we'll probably never know what took place here thousands of years ago.
But we can't expect Stukeley to have maintained the detachment of modern archaeologists. His work had been remarkably inventive and scientific for his day. But science, then in its infancy, could not provide the answers he sought. Instead, he found them in the world of imagination and religion. In the late 1720s, he took holy orders. Dr. Stukeley became the Reverend Stukeley, and from then on, his approach to the past completely changed. The Druids are the key. To begin with, he'd looked at them logically. As priests of the ancient Britons, mentioned by the Romans, there seemed a sound basis for associating them with the ancient monuments. But suddenly they were turned into honorary members of the Church of England in an extraordinary attempt to reconcile archaeology with the Bible.
They were of Abraham's religion entirely, and their faith was so extremely like Christianity that in effect it differed only in this. They believed in a Messiah who was to come into this world, as we believe in him that is come.
The world of superstition he had once rejected seemed to have reclaimed him. Even his friends now thought him fanciful. But the grandeur of his vision left a legacy as powerful as any scientific truth. He began a whole romantic tradition which gave life and imaginative meaning to the silence of the stones. The white-robed figures of the summer solstice are largely Stukeley's creation. They may bear little relationship to any ancient reality, but Stonehenge and the Druids have become part of the British psyche as the symbols of our ancient past. Claims to the sacred stones can induce a possessive hysteria. Stukeley's was the original alternative view of Stonehenge and monuments like it. He ensured that they would never just be the preserve of archaeologists. But beyond his achievement of the imagination, it is the science of archaeology which owes William Stukeley the greatest debt, for preserving knowledge of so much that might have been lost, and as the founding father of field archaeology.
If we examine into the antiquities of nations that had no writing among them, here are their monuments. These we are to explore. And the more we reason upon them, the more reason shall we find to admire the vast size of the minds of our predecessors.